the shadow of Westminster Abbey, beneath centuries of accumulated dust and forgotten whispers, lies a secret so mortifying that it was buried deeper than any royal treasure. The year was 1760, and the most powerful empire on earth was about to lose its king, not to war, not to poison, not to the blade of an assassin, but to something far more humiliating than any monarch should ever endure. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about royal deaths. This isn't some sanitized fairy tale about a peaceful passing surrounded by grieving courtiers. This is the raw, unvarnished truth about how one of Britain's most temperamental rulers met his end in circumstances so degrading that palace officials spent decades crafting elaborate lies to protect what remained of royal dignity. Picture this: a man who commanded armies across continents, who shaped the destiny of nations, who held the power of life and death over millions of subjects, reduced to his most vulnerable human moment. The irony is so complete, so devastating, that it reads like dark comedy written by the cruelest of gods. But this isn't fiction. This is the true story of George Augustus, second of his name, King of Great Britain and Ireland, and how explosive diarrhea brought down an empire's monarch. Before we dive into the grotesque details of that October morning, you need to understand the man whose bowels would ultimately betray him so spectacularly. George II wasn't your typical soft, pampered royal who lived his entire life wrapped in silk and protected from reality's sharp edges. This was a warrior king, a man forged in the fires of Germanic military tradition, someone who knew the smell of gunpowder and the weight of command. Born in the German state of Hanover on a cold November day in 1683, George Augustus entered a world where survival meant strength and weakness invited destruction. His childhood wasn't spent playing with golden toys in palace gardens. Instead, he learned the arts of war, diplomacy, and the ruthless calculations required to maintain power in an age where kingdoms rose and fell with the seasons. Standing barely average height but possessing the rigid posture of a lifetime soldier, George presented an imposing figure despite his physical limitations. His face, angular and sharp, seemed carved from the same stone as the fortresses he would later command. Those who met him described eyes that could freeze blood in winter and a voice that could make seasoned generals tremble like schoolchildren. The powdered wigs of his era couldn't soften the harsh Germanic features that marked him as foreign in the land he would rule for over 3 decades. But beneath that intimidating exterior lurked a volcanic temper that would erupt without warning. Palace servants learned to read the subtle signs, the tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers would drum against his sword hilt, the dangerous stillness that preceded his legendary explosions of rage. When George's fury unleashed itself, courtiers scattered like leaves before a hurricane, knowing that proximity to the king's wrath could end careers, reputations, and sometimes lives. This was no mere political theatre designed to intimidate rivals. George's anger burned with genuine fire, fueled by frustrations that accumulated like gunpowder in a sealed barrel. He despised the English nobility's condescending attitudes toward his Germanic origins. He loathed the way they mocked his accent, the way they whispered about his foreign mannerisms, the way they treated him like an unwelcome guest in what was supposed to be his own kingdom. The transformation from German prince to British monarch hadn't been smooth. When the crown fell to the House of Hanover through the complex web of Protestant succession, George found himself inheriting a throne he'd never truly wanted, in a country that didn't particularly want him either. The English viewed their new German kings with suspicion bordering on hostility, while George never stopped considering Hanover his true home. This cultural displacement created a permanent tension that would define his entire reign. George spoke English with a thick German accent that became heavier when he was angry, which was frequently. He preferred German food, German customs, and German advisors, much to the irritation of his British subjects, who expected their king to embrace English traditions wholeheartedly. The result was a monarch who always felt like a stranger in his own palace, ruling over people who never quite accepted him as their own. Yet for all his foreign origins and explosive temperament, George possessed qualities that would serve him well during one of the most turbulent periods in British history. His military background gave him an understanding of warfare that proved invaluable as Britain expanded its global empire through constant conflict. Unlike his predecessors who preferred to command from the safety of map rooms, George believed in leading from the front, sharing the dangers faced by common soldiers. This warrior mentality extended beyond mere battlefield tactics. George approached politics with military precision, treating parliamentary debates like strategic campaigns and viewing political opponents as enemies to be defeated rather than partners to be negotiated with. His method was direct, brutal, and often effective, though it earned him few friends among the sophisticated courtiers who preferred subtlety to sledgehammer diplomacy. The king's relationship with his subjects remained complicated throughout his reign. While they respected his military prowess and grudgingly admired his refusal to back down from any challenge, they never warmed to him personally. George made little effort to charm or court popular opinion, believing that respect should flow naturally from strength rather than being manufactured through false pleasantries and political theatre. This emotional distance became even more pronounced after the death of his beloved wife, Caroline, in 1737. Their marriage had been one of the rare royal unions built on genuine affection rather than mere political convenience. Caroline possessed the intelligence and diplomatic skills that George lacked, often serving as an intermediary between her temperamental husband and the English establishment he struggled to understand. When Caroline died following a botched medical procedure, George's grief transformed into something darker and more consuming. The woman who had been his anchor in an alien culture was gone, leaving him more isolated than ever. His famous declaration that he would never remarry wasn't romantic sentiment, but the recognition that no one could replace the partnership that had made his reign possible. In the years following Caroline's death, George's legendary temper grew worse. Palace servants learned to approach him with extreme caution, never knowing when an innocent question might trigger an explosion of Germanic fury. He began spending more time alone, brooding in his private chambers or walking the palace gardens in solitary contemplation of mortality and loss. The king's health also began showing signs of the strain accumulated over decades of stress, warfare, and emotional turmoil. Court physicians noted increasing complaints of chest pains, shortness of breath during physical exertion, and digestive problems that seemed to worsen with each passing season. George dismissed these concerns with typical stubbornness, refusing to acknowledge any weakness that might be interpreted as vulnerability by his enemies or subjects. His vision began failing as cataracts clouded his eyes, forcing him to rely more heavily on advisors for reading documents and correspondence. The proud warrior who had once led cavalry charges now struggled to navigate palace corridors without assistance. These physical limitations only intensified his already formidable anger, creating a dangerous combination of declining capability and rising frustration that made him increasingly unpredictable. Yet even as his body betrayed him, George maintained the rigid daily routine that had defined his entire adult life. Military discipline had shaped his character since childhood, and he clung to structure and predictability as anchors in an increasingly uncertain world. Every morning began the same way, rising at precisely 6 o'clock, consuming his customary hot chocolate, receiving reports from various ministers and advisors, then attending to the endless bureaucratic demands of governing an expanding empire. This obsessive adherence to routine would ultimately contribute to the circumstances of his death, though none of the palace staff could have predicted how a simple morning ritual would end in catastrophe. George's insistence on privacy during certain daily activities reflected both his Germanic sensibilities and his growing need for moments of solitude away from the constant pressure of royal obligations. As October 1760 approached, the 76-year-old monarch showed all the signs of a man whose body was finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent in command. His physicians noted increasing irregularity in his digestive system, frequent complaints of abdominal discomfort, and episodes of what they delicately described as intestinal distress. But George, true to his stubborn nature, refused to modify his routine or acknowledge the severity of his declining health. The morning of October 25th began like countless others before it, with the king following his established pattern of activities. What none of them realized was that this ordinary Tuesday would become extraordinary for all the wrong reasons, marking the end of one of the most tumultuous reigns in British history through circumstances so undignified that the truth would be buried for centuries. The warning signs had been accumulating for months, though George's legendary stubbornness prevented him from acknowledging what his body was desperately trying to communicate. Palace physicians, walking the delicate line between medical honesty and royal sensitivities, documented a pattern of digestive disturbances that would have alarmed any reasonable patient. But George Augustus was not reasonable when it came to admitting weakness, and the mounting evidence of his deteriorating condition was dismissed with the same Germanic obstinacy that had defined his approach to everything else. Dr. Ranby, the royal physician, kept meticulous private notes that paint a disturbing picture of the king's final months. References to violent purging episodes, sudden cramping that would double the monarch over in apparent agony, and what the doctor euphemistically described as movements of extraordinary violence and frequency. These symptoms weren't merely the complaints of an aging man struggling with the natural decline of advanced years. They represented something far more serious, a cascade of physiological failures that was building toward inevitable catastrophe. The irony cuts deeper when you consider that George's obsession with maintaining routine may have actually accelerated his physical decline. His insistence on consuming the same foods, following the same schedule, and refusing to acknowledge his body's changing needs created a perfect storm of medical negligence. The rich Germanic cuisine he preferred, heavy with fats and spices that his aging digestive system could no longer process efficiently, became a daily assault on organs already compromised by decades of stress and poor medical understanding. Contemporary accounts from palace servants, carefully coded to avoid explicit details that might compromise royal dignity, speak of increasingly frequent episodes where the king would disappear for extended periods, emerging pale and shaken from private chambers. The household staff learned to recognize the signs: the sudden pallor that would wash across his face during formal ceremonies, the way his hands would clench into fists as internal pressures built beyond his control, the desperate excuse-making that would allow him to retreat from public view. What makes this medical deterioration even more tragic is the complete absence of effective treatment available during that era. 18th century medicine possessed virtually no understanding of digestive disorders, relying instead on primitive interventions that often made conditions worse rather than better. The standard treatments for intestinal distress involve purging with mercury-based compounds, bloodletting to balance the humours, and administration of opium-based preparations that provided temporary relief while masking underlying problems. George's physicians, operating within the constraints of contemporary medical knowledge, prescribed treatments that would seem barbaric by modern standards. Regular doses of calomel, a mercury chloride compound known to cause severe intestinal damage, were administered to promote what they believed was healthy purging. Frequent bloodletting sessions weakened his already compromised system, while opium tinctures provided temporary relief at the cost of creating dependency that complicated his condition further. The king's increasing isolation during these final months wasn't merely psychological withdrawal following his wife's death years earlier. It represented a desperate attempt to maintain royal dignity while managing a medical condition that was becoming impossible to conceal. Palace protocols had no provisions for handling a monarch whose body was betraying him in such fundamentally undignified ways. The elaborate ceremonies and public appearances that defined royal life became increasingly difficult to navigate as George's condition deteriorated. Foreign ambassadors began noting subtle changes in the king's behavior and appearance during formal audiences. The Venetian envoy wrote diplomatically of His Majesty's occasional discomfort during extended ceremonies, while the French ambassador observed that the king seemed increasingly eager to conclude meetings with unusual haste. These diplomatic euphemisms masked a growing awareness among the international community that something was seriously wrong with Britain's monarch. The political implications of George's declining health created additional pressures that may have worsened his condition. Britain was engaged in the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that required constant royal attention and decision-making. The king's legendary temper, always formidable, became even more unpredictable as physical discomfort combined with the stress of managing an empire at war. Ministers learned to time their meetings carefully, avoiding periods when the king's digestive distress was most likely to manifest. Palace architecture, designed for ceremony and grandeur rather than practical convenience, became an additional source of torment for the aging monarch. The distances between royal apartments and private facilities, considered insignificant during the palace's construction, now represented potential catastrophes for a man whose body could betray him without warning. Servants noted the king's increasing familiarity with every corridor, every shortcut, every private route that might provide emergency access to relief when needed. The psychological toll of living with such an unpredictable and undignified condition cannot be underestimated. George, who had built his entire identity around strength, control, and military precision, found himself subject to the whims of his own digestive system. The man who had faced enemy cannons without flinching now lived in constant fear of his own body's betrayals, never knowing when a formal ceremony might be interrupted by urgent biological demands. His relationship with food became increasingly complicated as he attempted to identify triggers for his worsening symptoms. The royal kitchens received increasingly specific and contradictory instructions about meal preparation, as George desperately tried to find combinations that wouldn't provoke violent digestive responses. The Germanic dishes he loved became suspected enemies, while bland English preparations that he despised seemed to offer temporary reprieve from his suffering. Sleep became another battleground in his war against his failing body. Palace servants reported being awakened by sounds of distress emanating from the royal chambers, though protocol prevented them from investigating unless specifically summoned. The king's bedroom was relocated closer to private facilities, a practical modification that carried the humiliating implication that Britain's monarch could no longer trust his body to maintain dignity throughout the night. Dr. Ramby's notes from this period reveal a physician walking an impossible tightrope between medical responsibility and royal protocol. His observations suggest that George's condition was progressing toward what modern medicine would recognize as potentially fatal complications, but 18th century understanding provided no framework for comprehending the true danger. References to increasing pain, episodes of what appeared to be internal bleeding, and the king's growing inability to maintain normal activities paint a picture of systemic failure that was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control. The morning routine that had provided structure and comfort throughout George's adult life was becoming an ordeal of uncertainty and potential humiliation. The simple act of rising, consuming his customary hot chocolate, and beginning his daily schedule now required careful timing and strategic planning. Palace servants learned to have contingency plans ready, alternative routes prepared, and emergency protocols in place for situations that could not be discussed openly, but were becoming increasingly frequent. What none of them could have predicted was how completely and catastrophically this careful balance would collapse on that ordinary October morning. The king, who had survived battlefield wounds, political conspiracies, and decades of accumulated stress, was about to be defeated by the most basic and universal of human vulnerabilities. The irony would have been amusing if the consequences weren't so absolute and the circumstances so mortifyingly undignified. As dawn broke over Kensington Palace on October 25, 1760, the household staff prepared for what they assumed would be another difficult but manageable day in the ongoing challenge of caring for their increasingly frail monarch. The elaborate machinery of royal routine ground into motion. servants taking their positions, meals being prepared according to the king's current dietary restrictions, and schedules being adjusted to accommodate the unpredictable demands of his failing health. None of them realized they were witnessing the final sunrise of the Hanoverian dynasty's second king, or that the day's events would create a scandal so profound that the truth would be buried beneath layers of official lies and diplomatic euphemisms. The stage was set for a conclusion so undignified, so completely contrary to everything George had spent his life building, that it would redefine the very concept of royal mortality. The king himself, rising at his customary hour and following the routine that had become both comfort and prison, had no inkling that his body was preparing to deliver its ultimate betrayal. The digestive system that had tormented him for months was about to exact a final, fatal revenge that would reduce one of Europe's most powerful monarchs to the level of common mortality in the most humiliating way imaginable. The porcelain chamber that would witness the downfall of an empire had been crafted with the finest materials available to Georgian sensibilities. Italian marble imported at enormous expense, gold fixtures that gleamed in the candlelight, and walls adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of military triumph. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. A room designed to showcase royal luxury would become the stage for the most undignified death in British royal history. George's morning routine on October 25th began with ominous signs that palace staff later recognized as harbingers of catastrophe. His personal valet, Johann Schmidt, noted that His Majesty appeared more agitated than usual during the dressing ritual. The king complained of intestinal cramping that seemed more severe than his recent episodes, and there was a greyish pallor beneath his powder that suggested something fundamental was going wrong within his aging body. The hot chocolate that had comforted George through decades of morning rituals now sat heavy in his stomach, like molten lead. Contemporary medical understanding blamed such digestive disturbances on imbalances of the humours, but what was actually occurring inside the king's abdomen was far more sinister. The years of mercury-based treatments had weakened the walls of his digestive tract, while the constant stress of ruling an empire had created the perfect conditions for what modern physicians would recognize as a massive aortic aneurysm. This silent killer had been growing for months, perhaps years, creating a ticking bomb within the royal torso. The weakened arterial wall, stretched beyond its capacity by decades of elevated blood pressure from chronic rage and Germanic obstinacy, was finally approaching its breaking point. Each heartbeat pushed against the damaged vessel with increasing pressure, while George remained completely unaware that death was literally pulsing through his circulatory system. The warning signs had been there for anyone with modern medical knowledge to recognize. The increasing shortness of breath during physical exertion wasn't merely the expected decline of advanced age. It was his cardiovascular system struggling to compensate for a catastrophic weakness in his major artery. The chest pains he dismissed as indigestion were actually his heart working desperately to maintain circulation through a compromised vessel that was slowly expanding like a balloon being inflated beyond its capacity. Palace physicians, operating within the primitive constraints of 18th century medicine, had no framework for understanding what was happening inside their royal patient. They attributed his symptoms to an excess of bile, an imbalance of hot and cold humours, or perhaps divine punishment for his legendary temper. The concept of arterial rupture was so far beyond their medical comprehension that they might as well have been trying to diagnose a space alien. As George made his way toward his private chambers that morning, he was carrying within his body a medical catastrophe that would have challenged even modern emergency medicine. The aneurysm had likely reached critical dimensions, creating a bulge in his aorta roughly the size of a tennis ball. The arterial wall at this point would have been stretched tissue thin, held together by little more than divine providence and Germanic stubbornness. The king's insistence on maintaining his rigid morning schedule, regardless of his physical condition, was about to prove fatally misguided. His determination to project strength and normalcy, admirable qualities that had served him well throughout his military career, now became liabilities that prevented him from recognizing the severity of his condition. A wiser man might have summoned physicians at the first sign of serious distress, but George Augustus had never been accused of wisdom when his pride was at stake. The bathroom where he sought privacy was a marvel of contemporary luxury, equipped with the finest facilities available to Georgian royalty. The toilet itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved from a single block of Italian marble and fitted with silver fixtures that reflected the morning light streaming through stained glass windows. The floor was laid with intricate mosaic patterns that told the story of British military victories, creating an ironic backdrop for what was about to unfold. Modern forensic analysis of similar aneurysm cases suggests that George would have experienced a sudden, overwhelming sensation of pressure in his abdomen as the critical moment approached. The pain would have been unlike anything he had previously experienced, not the familiar cramping of his digestive troubles, but a tearing sensation, as if something vital was literally ripping apart inside his torso. This was his aorta beginning its final catastrophic failure. The straining motion that triggered the rupture was tragically mundane, exactly the kind of everyday human activity that reduces kings to the same level as their humblest subjects. The increased abdominal pressure created by this natural bodily function pushed his already weakened arterial wall beyond its breaking point. What happened next occurred with the speed and finality of a cannon shot, though the only witnesses were marble statues and tapestried walls that would keep their secrets for centuries. The rupture itself would have been accompanied by internal hemorrhaging so massive and rapid that consciousness fled almost immediately. Modern medical estimates suggest that George lost approximately half his blood volume within minutes, creating a cascade of physiological failures that no 18th century physician could have addressed, even if they had been present. His blood pressure would have plummeted catastrophically, while his heart raced desperately to maintain circulation through a system that was literally pouring his life onto the marble floor. The sound that alerted palace staff, that terrible thud that echoed through the royal chambers, wasn't just the impact of a falling body. It was the acoustic signature of imperial power meeting biological reality, the moment when all the ceremonies and protocols and divine right of kings collided with the simple fact that every human body is ultimately subject to mechanical failure. The king, who had commanded armies across continents, was defeated by his own circulatory system in the space of heartbeats. Johann Schmidt, the valet who discovered the scene, would later describe it in carefully coded language that preserved royal dignity while hinting at the horror he encountered. The official reports speak of His Majesty being found in a state of repose, having passed peacefully in private contemplation. The reality was far more disturbing. A 76-year-old man crumpled on marble tile, his royal robes stained with evidence of his body's final betrayal, his powdered wig askew to reveal the thin grey hair of mortality beneath the pretense of eternal youth. The head wound that bloodied the pristine marble had occurred during the fall, adding a grotesque punctuation mark to an already undignified death. George's skull, weakened by age and the constant stress of ruling an empire, had cracked against the unforgiving stone like an egg dropped from a great height. The irony was complete. The head that had worn the crown of Great Britain now leaked its contents across a bathroom floor, mixing royal blood with the evidence of digestive failure in a tableau that would have satisfied the darkest satirist. Palace protocol had no provisions for handling such a catastrophically undignified royal death. The elaborate machinery of court ceremony was designed around the assumption that monarchs expired in their beds, surrounded by grieving courtiers and attended by physicians who could provide dignified witness to their final moments. The discovery of a king dead on a bathroom floor, his body betrayed by the most basic biological functions, created an unprecedented crisis that threatened the very foundations of royal mystique. The immediate response involved a conspiracy of silence that would span centuries. Schmidt, the unfortunate valet who made the discovery, was sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of execution for treason. The palace physicians who examined the body were similarly bound by oaths that carried the weight of their lives and the lives of their families. Even the servants who cleaned the scene were separated, relocated to distant parts of the empire, and forbidden from ever discussing what they had witnessed. Dr. Frank Nichols, the royal physician summoned to examine the body, faced an impossible challenge. His medical training told him that the king had died from massive internal hemorrhaging caused by arterial rupture, but royal protocol demanded an explanation that preserved monarchical dignity. The solution was a masterpiece of euphemistic language that acknowledged the medical reality while obscuring the humiliating circumstances. Death by rupture of the right ventricle of the heart, a technically accurate diagnosis that omitted the location and context of the fatal episode. The preparation of George's body for burial required extraordinary measures to conceal the evidence of his undignified end. Skilled embalmers worked through the night to repair the damage caused by the fall and the massive internal bleeding, using techniques that bordered on artistic reconstruction. The king's final public appearance would show no trace of the circumstances that had actually killed him, presenting instead the carefully crafted image of a monarch who had passed peacefully into eternal rest. The official announcement of the king's death delayed for hours while palace officials crafted their cover story, spoke of His Majesty succumbing suddenly to heart failure while attending to morning correspondence in his private study. This sanitized version became the accepted historical record, repeated in court chronicles and diplomatic reports that spread across Europe, with no hint of the mortifying truth that lay beneath the carefully constructed lie. Foreign ambassadors, gathered to pay their respects to the deceased monarch, noted the unusual restrictions placed on viewing the body. Unlike previous royal deaths, where diplomatic protocol typically allowed close examination of the deceased as proof of natural death rather than foul play, George's corpse was presented in a closed casket with only his face visible through a small window. This departure from tradition sparked rumors and speculation that persisted for decades, though none of the gossips came close to guessing the undignified reality. The funeral arrangements themselves became an exercise in compensatory grandeur, as if the elaborate ceremony could somehow erase the ignoble circumstances of the king's actual death. Westminster Abbey was draped in black velvet and cloth of gold, while hundreds of candles created a cathedral of light that transformed the Gothic architecture into a shrine worthy of imperial mythology. The procession included representatives from every corner of the British Empire, each paying homage to a monarch whose true final moments would have destroyed their carefully maintained reverence. George's body was interred in a lead-lined coffin designed to preserve royal remains for centuries, but also serving the practical purpose of ensuring that the physical evidence of his undignified death would remain sealed forever. The elaborate tomb, carved with scenes of military triumph and imperial glory, stands as a monument to the power of myth-making over historical truth. Every visitor who pays respects to the great warrior king remains unaware that they are honoring a man who died in circumstances that would have provided material for satirists and pamphleteers for generations. The immediate political consequences of George's death were managed with remarkable efficiency by ministers who understood that imperial stability depended on maintaining the illusion of royal invincibility. The transition to his grandson, George III, proceeded smoothly, precisely because the new king's advisors ensured that no whisper of his predecessor's undignified end could undermine the mystique of monarchical authority. The crown passed from one head to another without the slightest public acknowledgement that the previous wearer had died in circumstances that reduced him to the level of common mortality. Yet even as the official machinery of royal succession ground forward with ceremonial precision, those who knew the truth carried with them a secret that would fundamentally alter their understanding of power and mortality. The servants who had cleaned blood from marble floors, the physicians who had examined a body betrayed by its most basic functions, the courtiers who had helped craft the elaborate deception. All of them now possessed knowledge that revealed the profound vulnerability hidden beneath the pageantry of absolute rule. The psychological impact on those who witnessed the scene cannot be overstated. These were individuals whose entire worldview was built around the concept of royal exceptionalism, the belief that kings were somehow elevated above the common frailties that plagued ordinary mortals. To see their sovereign reduced to such a fundamentally human level of indignity created a cognitive dissonance that some never fully resolved. Palace records suggest that several staff members requested transfers to distant posts rather than continue serving in chambers that reminded them daily of what they had witnessed. The broader implications of George's death extended far beyond the immediate crisis of succession. His passing marked the end of an era when British monarchs still possessed real political power, still led armies into battle, still shaped the destiny of nations through personal will and charisma. His grandson would inherit a throne already being transformed by parliamentary government and constitutional limitations, beginning the long evolution toward the ceremonial monarchy that would eventually emerge in later centuries. But perhaps most significantly, George's death represented a moment when the carefully constructed mythology of royal divinity collided with the inescapable reality of biological mortality. The elaborate ceremonies, the divine right of kings, the pageantry of absolute power, all of it was revealed as elaborate theatre designed to obscure the simple fact that every human body, regardless of the crown it wears, remains subject to the same fundamental vulnerabilities that unite peasants and princes in their shared mortality. The secret that died with George Augustus on that October morning would remain buried for centuries, protected by the conspiracy of silence that transformed one of history's most undignified deaths into a carefully sanitized historical footnote. But the truth, like blood seeping through marble, has a way of eventually reaching the surface, carrying with it implications that extend far beyond the fate of a single monarch or the dignity of a particular dynasty. The cover-up that followed George's death would become one of the most successful deceptions in royal history, a masterclass in controlling narrative that would influence how power protects itself from inconvenient truths for centuries to come. Within hours of the discovery, Kensington Palace transformed into a hive of frantic activity as officials worked to construct an alternative reality that would preserve not just royal dignity, but the entire foundation upon which monarchical authority rested. The first priority was controlling the witnesses. Johann Schmidt, the unfortunate valet who had made the gruesome discovery, found himself at the center of a web of threats and promises that would define the rest of his life. Palace officials made it clear that his continued existence depended entirely on his ability to forget what he had seen. The official story was simple. He had found His Majesty peacefully expired in his private study, having succumbed to sudden heart failure while reviewing correspondence. Any deviation from this narrative would be considered treason punishable by death. But Schmidt wasn't the only problem. The palace cleaning staff, who had been summoned to address the aftermath of the king's death, posed an even greater challenge. These were common servants whose loyalty could not be assumed and whose discretion could not be guaranteed. The solution was as ruthless as it was effective: immediate dispersal across the empire. Some were shipped to colonial postings in India, where communication with England was sporadic at best. Others found themselves relocated to remote Scottish estates or Irish holdings where their isolation ensured silence. The most problematic witnesses were the palace physicians who had examined the body and understood the medical implications of what they had discovered. Dr. Frank Nichols, the senior royal physician, faced an impossible ethical dilemma. His medical training compelled him to record the true cause of death, but his position at court demanded absolute loyalty to royal interests. The compromise he reached would echo through centuries of medical ethics debates. Technical accuracy wrapped in diplomatic language. Nichols's official report described the king's death as resulting from a sudden rupture of the right ventricle of the heart, precipitating immediate cardiac failure and subsequent expiration. This masterpiece of medical euphemism satisfied both accuracy and discretion. The heart had indeed failed, though the report carefully omitted that this failure was secondary to massive hemorrhaging, caused by aortic rupture during the most undignified of circumstances. The physical evidence presented its own challenges. The marble floor of the royal bathroom told a story in bloodstains and other bodily fluids that contradicted every official narrative about peaceful expiration in a study. Specialized craftsmen were summoned from across London, sworn to secrecy, and tasked with completely replacing the affected stonework. The original marble was broken into fragments and scattered in the Thames, ensuring that no physical trace of the king's humiliating end could ever surface to contradict the carefully constructed lie. Even the king's clothing from that fatal morning required special handling. The royal robes, stained with evidence of his body's final betrayal, were burned in a specially constructed furnace within the palace grounds. Court records show payments to a master tailor for creating identical replacement garments that could be displayed as the clothes the king had worn during his peaceful death in the study. Every thread that had witnessed the truth was reduced to ash and scattered to the winds. The conspiracy extended to the highest levels of government. Prime Minister Newcastle and his inner circle were briefed on the real circumstances within hours of the discovery, but they immediately recognized that revealing the truth would create a constitutional crisis that could destabilize the entire realm. A king who died while straining on a toilet was not just an embarrassment to royal dignity. It was a weapon that political enemies and foreign powers could wield to undermine British authority across the globe. The timing couldn't have been worse. Britain was engaged in the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that required absolute confidence in royal leadership to maintain colonial support and international alliances. News that the British king had died in such undignified circumstances would have provided endless propaganda material for French enemies and encouraged rebellion in distant territories where royal authority hung by threads of perceived invincibility. Foreign ambassadors posed another challenge. Diplomatic protocol required that they be informed of the king's death and allowed to pay their respects, but their trained eyes might detect inconsistencies in the official story. The solution was carefully choreographed theatre. The king's body was positioned in his study, surrounded by papers and books to support the narrative of death while working. Heavy perfumes masked any lingering odours, while strategic lighting concealed the pallor and other signs of the massive blood loss that had actually killed him. The Venetian ambassador, known for his medical knowledge, was watched particularly carefully during his formal viewing of the body. Palace officials noted with relief that he detected nothing suspicious in the king's appearance, though private letters later revealed that he found the elaborate security surrounding the corpse unusual compared to previous royal deaths. The French envoy similarly noted the restricted access and heavy guard presence, but attributed it to wartime security concerns rather than evidence of deception. Religious authorities created their own complications. The Archbishop of Canterbury was required to perform last rites and offer prayers for the deceased monarch's soul. But church doctrine held specific beliefs about the spiritual implications of different types of death. Dying while performing bodily functions carried theological complications that could affect the king's eternal fate, according to contemporary Christian understanding. The Archbishop was briefed on the sanitized version of events and warned that any deviation from the official narrative would be considered heresy against the crown. The elaborate funeral preparations served multiple purposes beyond honoring the deceased monarch. The sheer scale and grandeur of the ceremonies helped distract public attention from any inconsistencies in the death narrative, while reinforcing the image of royal majesty that the true circumstances had so thoroughly undermined. Westminster Abbey became a stage for one of history's most successful deceptions, as thousands of mourners paid respects to a carefully constructed myth rather than the humiliating reality. Court artists faced unique challenges in creating the official portraits and commemorative works that would define George's legacy. Traditional death portraits showed monarchs in peaceful repose, their faces reflecting the dignity of their final moments. But the king's actual expression at death, distorted by pain, shock, and the physical trauma of massive arterial rupture, bore no resemblance to the serene majesty expected in royal art. Skilled painters worked from life masks and earlier portraits to create images that showed the king as he should have died rather than as he actually had. The most challenging aspect of the cover-up was managing the emotional toll on those who knew the truth. Palace servants who had witnessed the scene or participated in the cleanup suffered what modern psychology would recognize as trauma responses. Several requested immediate retirement despite generous financial incentives to remain silent. Others developed drinking problems or exhibited signs of severe anxiety that palace physicians attributed to grief over their beloved sovereign's passing, rather than horror at the circumstances they had witnessed. The conspiracy's success depended on creating alternative memories for those who might otherwise spread inconvenient truths. Palace officials worked systematically to plant false recollections among staff members who had been near the scene but hadn't witnessed the actual discovery. Stories were carefully crafted about finding the king peacefully slumped over his desk, surrounded by the papers he had been reviewing when his heart gave out. These fabricated memories were repeated so often and with such conviction that some participants began to believe them themselves. International implications of the deception extended far beyond British shores. Colonial governors across the empire received carefully worded dispatches describing the king's peaceful death while attending to affairs of state. These reports were designed to reinforce the image of a dedicated monarch who literally worked himself to death in service of his subjects. The narrative served British interests by portraying George as a martyr to duty rather than a victim of biological failure in embarrassing circumstances. The financial cost of maintaining the deception was enormous, but considered essential for preserving royal authority. Payments to witnesses, craftsmen, and officials involved in the cover-up drained the royal treasury, but these expenses were hidden within larger budget allocations for funeral preparations and transition costs. Modern analysis of palace accounts reveals mysterious payments to individuals whose identities were deliberately obscured, suggesting a systematic program of buying silence from anyone who might threaten the official narrative. Scientific understanding of the era actually aided the deception in unexpected ways. Medical knowledge was so primitive that few people possessed the expertise to question the official cause of death. The concept of aortic aneurysm was unknown to all but the most advanced physicians, while the general public had no framework for understanding how someone could die from internal bleeding caused by straining during bowel movements. The very impossibility of explaining the real cause of death to contemporary audiences made the simple heart failure narrative more believable. The psychological warfare aspect of the cover-up targeted potential skeptics with surgical precision. Pamphlets and broadsheets appeared across London celebrating the king's dedication to duty and emphasizing how he had literally died while working for the good of his subjects. These publications, secretly funded by palace officials, created a narrative momentum that made questioning the official story seem unpatriotic and disrespectful to the deceased monarch's memory. Religious sermons preached from pulpits across the realm reinforced the official version while adding spiritual dimensions that made doubt seem sinful. Ministers spoke of how God had called his faithful servant home, while the king attended to his sacred duties of governance. The divine timing of death during work rather than leisure was presented as evidence of royal virtue, creating theological justification for the carefully constructed lie. The success of George's death cover-up established precedents that would influence royal protocol for centuries. Future palace officials would study the techniques used to manage this crisis, incorporating lessons learned into standard procedures for handling embarrassing royal incidents. The machinery of deception created in October 1760 became a template for protecting monarchical dignity from inconvenient truths that might undermine public confidence in royal authority. But perhaps most remarkably, The conspiracy succeeded so completely that it fooled not just contemporary audiences, but generations of historians who accepted the sanitized version without question. Academic scholars, trained to skeptically examine historical sources, repeated the heart failure narrative in countless books and articles without recognizing the signs of deliberate deception. The truth remained buried beneath layers of official documentation and diplomatic correspondence that obscured rather than illuminated the real circumstances of the king's death. The broader implications extended beyond British shores, as European courts observed how effectively their English counterparts had managed a potentially catastrophic public relations disaster. Techniques pioneered during George's death cover-up would be adopted and refined by royal houses across the continent, creating an international standard for protecting monarchical dignity from embarrassing truths that might undermine the carefully maintained fiction of royal exceptionalism. The human cost of maintaining this deception cannot be calculated in mere financial terms. Lives were fundamentally altered as witnesses were scattered across the globe, careers were destroyed to protect state secrets, and individuals carried psychological burdens that could never be shared or resolved. The palace servants who cleaned blood from marble floors, the physicians who examined a body betrayed by its own biology, the courtiers who helped craft elaborate lies, all became prisoners of a secret that defined the remainder of their lives. Yet the conspiracy's very success revealed something profound about the nature of power and truth in human society. The ability to transform embarrassing reality into dignified mythology demonstrated how effectively established authority could control narrative even when faced with facts that completely contradicted official versions of events. George's death became a case study in how institutional power protects itself by managing information and manipulating public perception. And there, in the cold marble chambers of Kensington Palace, lies the ultimate truth about power and mortality. The king, who conquered nations, who shaped the destiny of empires, who commanded the fear and respect of millions, was ultimately defeated not by enemy armies or political conspiracies, but by the most basic and universal of human frailties. George II's explosive end serves as history's most brutal reminder that beneath every crown, behind every ceremony, within every display of absolute authority, beats the fragile heart of mortal flesh, subject to the same indignities that humble the poorest beggar. The secret buried with him that October morning continues to whisper from beyond the grave, challenging everything we believe about power, dignity, and the carefully constructed myths that sustain civilizations. In death, the warrior king achieved something no victory on any battlefield could have accomplished. He proved that mortality is the great equalizer, reducing emperors and peasants alike to the same vulnerable humanity when their bodies finally betray them in the most undignified